Hey there, on today's episode of Golden Key Design, we're going to take this closet and turn it into this. Stay tuned to see how I did it. So here's our starting point. Nothing crazy, but there's not much storage in this closet. There's a few wire shelves on the right and then one wire shelf all the way across, but you can't really get that many clothes in here, and I want to add some color and some pop to this closet, so let's get to it. I started with demo, first taking out the carpet and then the pad underneath. This was a lot of dust, so I made sure to wear a mask during this process, but it wasn't too bad. Then after removing the baseboard, I could get on to removing the doors, and these are actually not going to be reinstalled as we're going to be going with an open closet design. I then removed all of the wire shelves, and there was a fair amount of holes left over, but I went back and patched those, and in the meantime I also painted the whole room, but you can go watch part 2 of this renovation series if you want to see that. Alright, so now that we patched up the drywall and gave it a nice prime surface, it's now time to put up our wallpaper. We bought some from Home Depot that's just peel and stick, so it's nice and simple. And we're going to go with a black wallpaper with a slight geometric design to give the room some interest and also draw your eye into the closet. Let's get started. I'll make sure to link all the products down in the description that we use in this video, including this wallpaper. And then with some help from Olive, we were able to pull it out to about 8 feet, and then we cut it with just a utility knife, cut pretty easily. Just make sure you want to get a square cut there so it's not at an angle. Then we put up our first piece. Wallpaper can be difficult and it also can be easy. I think having 2 sets of hands definitely makes it a little bit easier, but there's always going to be some bubbles, so you want to make sure that you invest in a nice squeegee to apply the wallpaper to your walls. And then it's just a rinse and repeat process from there, making sure to line up the pattern. So this one we had a geometric pattern that actually repeated every 24 inches roughly, and so we just made sure that when we cut our new pieces that we cut them so they would line up with the piece next to it. After that, I then applied the trim to the outside of the door. Alright, so as you can see, we finished putting up the wallpaper. We put on the back wall, the side wall, and even this wall that you can't see, just so the whole thing is covered. But the last thing to do is put on the trim, including the baseboard and the inside door trim. So let's get to it. So you can't actually see what I'm doing, but I'm adding in that perimeter door trim around the inside of the closet, and no one's going to see this. However, I just wanted to cover it up so that you don't see this gap between the drywall and the door casing. I then applied the baseboard trim and just doing the similar process here, and I marked out all my studs with that blue painter's tape so I knew I was nailing it into a solid surface. Alright, now that all of the trim and wallpaper are in, we can get to installing the actual closet hardware now. I went to Home Depot the other day and bought a bunch of different black pipe, including a bunch of flanges and elbows in order to connect everything. Home Depot has a pipe cutting station that you can cut your pipes to whatever length that you need for your particular project, as well as thread the ends. But before we install them, we need to clean them as they are quite greasy and you don't want to get that on any of your clothes. So let's head out to the garage. Alright, so now we're in the garage, and as you can see we have all of our pipe laid out here, as well as a couple flanges and some T-connections. To clean off the grease, we're going to be using some mineral spirits, and to help with the abrasion a little bit, we're going to be using some steel wool to kind of break up the surface. I also bought a pair of rubber gloves, as this stuff is actually pretty sharp, so you want to protect your hands, as well as that'll keep all the grease off as well. So I'm probably going to get a bowl, pour some of that mineral spirits in it, and then dunk my steel wool in there, and then I'll just get to cleaning all these pieces, and I'll move them from this side of the table to this side of the table as they clean, then I'll let them dry, and then we can get to installing. Let's get to it. This isn't a difficult process, but it does get messy, so make sure you're not wearing your nicest clothes. But I took about 2 passes on each of the pieces, and everything went pretty smoothly. I just mainly focused my time on those black pipes as I was trying to get off some of the writing that was already on them. Alright, so now we have all of our pieces laid out. We have all of our flanges, our T connections, as well as our 90-degree elbow and all of the black pipe, which is now nice and clean. I'm going to be using my 3D CAD drawing that I made earlier as a reference to make sure I have everything facing the right direction and the parts in the right order. So now, let's get started. So this is pretty much like adult Legos. You can just start putting your pieces together one by one, making sure that you follow your design, and eventually you want to start moving it inside of the closet, as you might build it too big to the point where it doesn't actually fit inside, so be careful on that. Also, you want to screw your things as tightly as possible, and I'll explain why a little bit later. And here I couldn't get this to turn all the way, so I just screwed in a pipe to add some torque, and then I could spin it the direction that I needed to. Those 4 bars on the left going horizontally will support some shelves in the future that you'll see later in the video. And it was at this point that I realized I might have made it too big, but I was able to just barely sneak it into position. Luckily I hadn't put anything on the right side, it was just the left at this point. And here you can see what the left side looks like up close, and you want to make sure that at any point that it contacts the wall, you use a flange like this. So now I'm at the point where I'm trying to attach the pieces on the right side of the closet. This is actually very challenging because most times when you do something like this, you don't have two side walls, but in this case we do, and therefore it's hard to screw everything into position and still have it touching the walls. So what I did is I put it on a slight angle so that I had just enough room to start the rod into this T so that I could screw it in a little bit. Now I'm gonna try to put in the other one up here and then try and twist it all back. And hopefully I screwed it as tight as I could. Hopefully that leaves me just a little bit of margin between the edges and the wall, and then if I need to adjust, I can just unscrew it and it'll basically clamp itself into position. So hopefully you understood that. I know it's a bit tricky to understand verbally, so I'm gonna try and show you. All right, now in order to get everything to fit, I'm gonna try and make the width as narrow as possible. I'm gonna do that by tightening the pipes as hard as I can and also screwing in the flanges as far as I can, and that'll make the width just a little bit smaller. And then at that point, I can slide it back into position, and then I can, if I need to, unloosen them a bit to clamp it up against the walls. And in order to fully screw these pipes in as hard as I can, I'm going to be using a pipe wrench. I did as much as I could with just my hands, but the pipe wrench adds a lot more leverage so you can screw it in a lot more. Let's get to it. Alright, now that everything is screwed in as far as possible and the width is as narrow as possible, we can now turn it back to being 90 degrees and perpendicular with the walls, and then we can start unscrewing everything and clamp it into position.
So now I have everything in the correct position, but it's still fully tightened. So as you can see, there's a little bit of a gap between all the flanges and the wall. And now that I have everything in position, I can now loosen everything, or basically expand it left and right. So this will basically clamp everything into position and make everything nice and tight. Then at that point, I can go in and screw all my flanges into the wall. Here I couldn't find a stud, so I had to use drywall anchors, but on the other side there was a stud in the middle, so I used that instead. I also made sure to use drywall screws, as these are already black and so they blend in with all the colors. I then screwed it down into the floor to make it even more secure.
Alright, so as you can see, we have all the closet hardware installed. It's nice and secured, and it'll be plenty strong to hold the hangers and the shelves. So next up, we have to cut the shelves to size and install them. There's going to be 4 going here, 1 above each of these bars, as well as 7 hidden shelves on this back wall over here. I went to Home Depot and bought some 2-foot by 4-foot project panels. These are just pine boards glued up edge to edge, and this will make it nice and easy to create the shelves. So let's head out to the table saw and rip these down to size.
So I was able to make all of the shelves that I needed out of just 5 project panels, and I made sure to mark which sides of each that I liked the most and made sure those are on top. And if you don't have a table saw, your local big box store will most likely have a saw in their store that you can cut these down to size there. And I just have a contractor saw, not a fully fledged cabinet saw, and so there are some situations that are a bit precarious, specifically when you're cutting wood wider than it is long, like in this scenario right here. And unfortunately, the blade starts to bind, and eventually I turn off the saw. So you just gotta be careful. I wanted to show this, that not everything goes perfectly according to plan, but I was able to pull the project panel off and then have it recut with my jigsaw, and everything worked out just fine. But in those situations, you just gotta be careful. I then moved on to the finishing process after sanding everything down. So here I'm just setting up some boards with some screws on top so that I could prop all these boards up on top of them, and therefore it wouldn't affect the stain or the polyurethane. And so here I'm applying some Minwax Early American. It's my go-to stain. And here I'm using one of my new favorite products, which is this stain pad. I'll link it down in the description. But basically it soaks up a ton of stain and provides a really uniform finish, as opposed to using a cloth, which usually, even if it's lint-free, there's always some lint in it, and it usually doesn't get a perfect application and also doesn't soak up a ton of stain. I then moved on to the polyurethane application, and here I'm using Minwax's in a satin finish. And I always apply it with a foam brush, as I find it gives the best application and the easiest application, and then I just toss it after each coat. They only cost about $1 or $2, so it's not too bad. And here you can see some streaking in the middle, but I always make sure to go back all the way across from each side to make sure that I get a nice smooth surface after it dries.
So I'm now starting to install the shelves on this side of the closet. So as you can see, I already installed the first shelf, but that one was a bit odd because I had to work around the baseboard. But for the other 3 shelves, it's going to be a pretty simple process. I was able to find 2 studs on the back wall, one here and one here, and so I already drilled some pocket holes in my next shelf that align with those 2 studs. So now I'm going to take my shelf, put it into position, making sure that I'm working my way up from the bottom shelf to the top shelf, because I don't think I'd be able to actually fit them into position if I went the other way around. So now I'm pushing it up against the back wall. I'm going to drill in those 2 pocket screws, and that'll hold it into position in the back. The bar will support it, but to make sure that the shelf doesn't come up off of the pipe,
I got some of these straps that I will screw in from the bottom, and that will keep the shelf nice and secure. Let's get to it.
So for these shelves, the majority of the weight and structure is actually coming from the pipe, which is extremely strong, and so the pocket screws in the back and these pipe clamps underneath are really just to support it in place, but again, they're not really adding too much structural integrity.
That looks so good. Very happy with that. All right, now that we installed all the shelves here on my right, we're gonna install 7 shelves here on my left. I made 7 shelves in total that will be going basically from the floor to the ceiling, and we're gonna be using a similar method of installing, using some pocket holes and some brad nails if needed. Let's get to it. Hey there. Alright, it's hard to get these shots of such a small closet, but I just installed now the shelf on top of this first pipe and then the second shelf on top of this top pipe. And so those basically were fixed distances because I wanted those to fall exactly on the pipe so they were structurally sound. Now the rest I want to evenly space, and I measured the distance from these 2 shelves that I now installed, and it's 42 inches, and I want to put 2 shelves in between. So that means I do 42 divided by 3, which is 14 inches. So now I know that I want each shelf to be 14 inches apart, and that's what these blue tapes are for. That just basically is my alignment so that as I install the next shelf, I know exactly where to line it up and everything will look nice and uniform. Let's get to it. Alright, so I'm just about to install my next shelf, and I just want to show you guys how I'm aligning my pocket screws. I have one in the middle and one on either side. Unfortunately, there's not a stud in the middle of either side, but there is usually a stud always in the corner. And then on the back wall, I have a stud right in the middle. And we're just gonna see how these 3 screws will hold it. I'm just gonna kind of see with my hand if it's strong or not. And if not, I can always add a brad nail or 2 on the front to keep it from tipping side to side. Now for these higher shelves, I'm actually placing the pocket holes on the top of the shelf because you won't be able to see them when you're standing on the ground. However, for the lower shelves, I'm gonna be putting the pocket holes on the underside. So you kind of just have to see where your eye line is and then make everything above that with the pocket holes on top and everything below that with the pocket holes on the bottom. Let's get to it. Alright, so that's going to wrap up this week's project. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something along the way. Let me know what you guys think of it down in the comments below. I know that an open closet without any doors is pretty unconventional and not the norm, but I think that the way that we designed it actually looks pretty good. I really like the colors with the black wallpaper and the steel pipe and also these wood shelves on either side. I think it all really ties the room together nicely. We also added these storage bags. There's 6 of them, and you can put things in here that you don't want necessarily people seeing since there aren't any doors in the closet. Yet they are still very functional and have a cool design aesthetic. And this steel bar, I don't know if you can tell, but it's extremely strong. I have it screwed into 3 different walls, and I could pretty much do a chin-up on this thing if I wanted to. And now that this project is finally done, I think it's time to put some clothes in here and start utilizing this room. And as always, thanks for watching and happy building. See you next week.